just by way of introduction, I'm Rhiannon Birch. I'm a principal consultant with SUMS. With me today I have two colleagues. So Helen, would you like to?
Hello, I'm Helen Watson. I'm the COO for City St George's, University of London.
Paul Boustead, ex-Chief People Officer from University of Leeds and now an associate with SUMS, along with other things.
Brilliant, thank you. And what Paul has noticed is we've only just got him today thanks to the vagaries of the railway system. So the way this is going to work, I will start off with a few broad comments and basically the warm-up act. I'll hand over to Helen and Paul for a couple of case studies, and then actually we'll hand over to you to have a conversation. And at the heart of this session, I guess, is almost a question that I asked. So when I do presentations on strategic planning, which is my background, I tend to put up a slide of a child in the back of a car. Because for me, planners are the people who are in the back of the car saying, are we there yet? And I presented this to a session recently with some HR professionals, and one of them said, well, actually, you're also looking outside the car. It works on so many levels. So I'm here as the planner saying, shared services, it should work. And how do we turn a why should we do this into a why shouldn't we do this? So I'm hoping we'll generate some ideas around that agenda as we're going through this session. I'm hoping by this point that you're asking why I have a picture of a dog wearing a hat on my first slide. And the reason for this is that I worked for a long time at the University of Sheffield. And earlier this year, I had a message from a colleague who said, Sheffield and Sheffield Hallam, they're merging. Are you sure? No, they absolutely are. It's in the student newspaper. So the Sheffield Tab newspaper is notorious for having the world's best April Fools, and this year's was a merger between Sheffield and Sheffield Hallam. And I'd got to the stage of texting a friend, and by the time she'd stopped laughing, she pointed out the date on the article. But then it led me to thinking, well, actually, why was that as credible as an April Fool? There's all kinds of reasons why shared services is a good idea. There's all kinds of times when I've wondered why, picking on Sheffield as an example, you have 4 HR departments, you have 4 finance departments, you have 4 lots of procurement happening. So this is really what we're hoping to explore in the next just under an hour, is why not, rather than why. So what are the things that will lead to those drivers for thinking differently? Now, not surprisingly, there are some things that we got together and had a conversation around in this space. So I'm not going to overlap particularly with things that we've heard earlier, but there are some ways that you can think about shared services. It is that continuum from deep collaboration right through into merger. One size is not going to fit all in this space. And Helen made this comment when we were in one of our really early conversations. Why would you do shared services unless it's going to actually save you money? It has to have that tangible financial output. I do a lot of work on target operating models, so I'm absolutely supportive of the fact that innovation, standardisation and consistency have all got their role to play. If you're not willing to talk from the same piece of paper, a shared service won't work. But there's also things in wider commercial opportunities or wider commercial techniques that we could be thinking about. So special purpose vehicles have been used to great effect by some universities, Coventry being the notable example. There are ways that these could be used in universities. And arguably, a point of Paul's when we were first meeting, government possibly has a role to play. If this is where they want us to go, so I know we talked earlier about the slight increase in fees, to me 250 quid is a start. Actually, there are other smoothing things that could be taken forward by government. If you're going to start with shared services, there's other things that you could think about. My favourite question, and one that I asked you UK recently, is why can't we just have a single sector student system? Don't answer the question, it was rhetorical because I know it leads to a lot of conversation, but we have a shared reporting service to the police, but we can't do it for higher education. There's all kinds of questions for me around that. It's also a leadership challenge. Staff will need to be taken on that cultural journey, and we will explore some of that through the case studies that we're about to hear. There's opportunities in the UK and overseas. Joel mentioned earlier about some UK overseas universities already working together. And I wonder, to the final point on this slide, whether actually institutional autonomy is becoming the thing that to a greater or lesser extent is trumping some of these harder-edged commercial decisions. I'm not going to go over the external macroeconomic context in a huge amount of detail, partly because I can't do the justice to it that David and Joel have already done. So I would suggest we bear all of those things in mind as we're going through this session, but come back to that question of why not rather than why. And And the one thing that we haven't thought about today is shifting employee expectations. So post-COVID, what we've heard is 52% of employers saying that flexible working policies will affect their decisions. I've already heard about universities who've mandated 2-3 days on site. I've heard about other universities who've been unwilling to go that far. Employees wanting to take their institutions to take action on issues that they actually care about. So a strategic direction piece in there, but also well-being, personalisation, first-person experience. A lot of these are also playing into this space. And if you're thinking about serious transformational change, all of these will affect those decisions and how you implement that kind of change. So at this point, you'll be pleased to hear that I'm going to stop talking and hand the clicker over to Helen to explore what happened with City St George's, University of London. Right hand one.
Yes, why not rather than why? I think that's probably in some ways sums up a lot of the spirit which has infused our university in recent years and led to us exploring discussions with St George's together. So, a little bit of context about the two institutions. City has a long-standing distinctive mission as University of Business Practice and the Professions, vocationally oriented, based in Islington, with a large health portfolio historically, around 26,000 students, which as a former planner, I must be clear, is headcount, not FTE. Around 3,000 staff, likewise headcount, not FTE, and I think including atypicals as well, and a turnover of 350 million. St George's, University of London, focus on medicine, biomedical sciences, allied health professions. That's south of the river in Tooting, around 4,000 students and around 850 staff, and a turnover of 90 million. So I think there's some interesting points there about the relative ties of the two institutions. We've seen various mergers around in the sector, but this is kind of 1/3, 2/3 in terms of size, so there's quite a lot of skin in the game on both sides, and we're very clear from the start, reflected in our trading name, to be our real name when the Privy Council gets around to approving it, of City St George's, University of London. So discussions started just as I joined in February 22. Took 2 years to get to transfer agreement, but then very rapidly going from transfer agreement to the merger date. I thought it a little bit like when you exchange on a house and then you go to completion. And that was a very deliberate tightness, because if you're not tight, what you really do is you sow uncertainty. And of course, we all know, as people who love and watch the sector, that St George's have been through this journey several times and really couldn't afford to go through another march up the aisle and back down again. So we were very keen to minimise the uncertainty. We don't want to rattle staff, didn't want to rattle students, didn't want to rattle applicants. But that very tight timescale then fed a lot of our other decisions. You're not going to build a fully merged, integrated university in a 4-month period. A lot of that transfer period was around the absolute necessity around due diligence, those sorts of things. And so what we were really focusing on for 1st of August was minimum viable product. We wanted to ensure that we were a legal and compliant institution that could teach students safely. We haven't even got merged security access over both sites yet. We're a long way off a merged finance and people systems, long way off student record systems. I think that is inevitable in the way we did this, but it did mean that the commitment is there and we're all one institution. A lot of the focus on this session will be around those sort of kind of shared cost savings that come with joint ventures, around shared services. But it's really important to me to highlight to you that this was really around academic strategic fit. And it's around the long game. Neither institution was in financial trouble. I mean, neither institution was in fabulous financial health. I suppose many are in this room. But this wasn't a distress merger. This was about getting ahead of the game and reflecting our profound belief that higher education is facing a major shake-up. And part of that is moving, I think, from a sort of high margin, low volume, to what we see more in the rest of the world, which is high volume, low margin. And so scale is very important to sustainability. And that was a lot of the thinking. And London's a very interesting environment because there's one or two very large institutions and there's a lot of quite small ones. So it was really around reflecting our assessment of the likely future shape of the sector. I've been in the sector a long time, and we've been talking a long time about whether we'll see an environment with a sort of kind of combination of smaller specialist institutions and then big mass educating. So there was kind of a sense of growing out of potential problems. I think there's been a number of lessons so far, which I think would be useful for people to think around in this. As I say, the main thing is around academic fit, and that's very strong. And I think you can think of that in terms of complementarity, which I think we've talked about elsewhere and will come up again later in the section. We have a lot of allied health professions north of the river, on what we now call the Clerkenwell campus, and there's very little overlap with the range of allied health professions south of the river. So there's high level of complementarity, but not a high level of internal competition. So that's very key. And if you're going to be the University for Business Practice and the Professions, most people would identify that very firmly with health professions. It reflects also government priorities, both the outgoing government and the new one around the focus on health and delivering a health workforce. And I think there's also an important point about geographical spread as well. One of the interesting features, again speaking as a planner around City, is a combination of internationally recruiting and locally recruiting. So we had a lot of students from overseas and not many from south of the river. You see the same thing a bit in Tooting, fewer from overseas, as you'd expect for allied health professions, and not many north of the river. So we now have a geographical spread which goes from north to south, and then through the excellent transport links we have in Clerkenwell with the Elizabeth line, east to west. So we've moved from being quite a local university to a London university through that merger. But I think there's a number of things I've learned in my role as the Chief Operating Officer around these things, even at this stage. I keep reminding people it's very early stages. The first thing to think about is what is your legal structure and what is your... There was a lot of conversations early on as we were sort of kind of exploring the excitement around the academic collaboration of merger of equal institutions. It doesn't really exist in governance terms. One set of governing instruments has to take over the other set of governing instruments. And I think we all have seen examples in institutions we've worked in over the years that things can get tricky if your governance structures and your management structures are not well aligned. And I think some of the conversations around selling in the prospect of equal academic collaboration has then led to difficulties as we build our decision-making structures, recruit our staff to the top roles, and reshape our council. So I think it's something about being clear-eyed as you go in. On the regulatory side, this was a new thing to the Office for Students, and we had some couple of conversations along the lines which kind of went, well, that's fascinating, let us know how it goes and don't forget to file a reportable event, was kind of where they were. So I think there's a question there around what we do as a sector to lobby in the longer term. You can't just click your heels and expect mergers to happen. If we are going to be looking at leveraging high volume, low margin, then I think there needs to be something around how we look at shared services, how we look at cost sharing, and whether there is a structural support at the early stages, because we are doing all of this at City St George's within our current very low margin, which therefore feeds very directly into how long it will be before we can actually really begin to leverage the financial benefits of this sort of merger. If you could give me £100 million to build a new student record system from scratch and an ERP within a 6-month period, we might be there. But if we're trying to do it from within our current margin, it's a very long journey. And banks are very risk averse at the moment. Even on things like rolling credit facilities, they were thoroughly burnt by the FE collapse. So even getting financing is quite a struggle. So therefore you're looking from within your very narrow margin to deliver the cash headroom to do the integration programme. And that, all of these things are trade-off between quality, time, and cost. And if you haven't got any money, then time is probably going to be the thing that's going to suffer rather than quality. So it's definitely an ultra marathon, not a sprint, as I keep telling people. And that then feeds into the people dimension. I would love it if everybody came to work absolutely focused on the charitable objectives of their institution and how to make that particular institution flourish. But as David was saying, people come into this all the time, and people's personal preferences can get very easily segue into their notion of what the strategic requirements are. So, you know, if people have taken the decision in their career to move to a small specialist institution for a particular notion they have around the autonomy that gives them and what they can do, they're not particularly enthralled when some Johnny Come lately found in 1964 up the road comes and merges with them. And I've had a certain amount of that on both sides. I think there's been a lack of, perhaps we tell ourselves things about our institutions which us planners may not think unless you're born up in the data. So there's a certain amount of jostling for sort of kind of, and even now I'm seeing sort of kind of the rumour mill goes into overdrive. And so don't underestimate how much change resource you need to build in from very early on to help bring people on that journey. And my final point is really realism, because yes, there will be uncertainty, and you may lose people, and you may gain other people. And really, one of the things I keep saying 4 months, 5 months in now, I'll have to stop doing it eventually, is we need to be kind to ourselves. This is uncharted territory. We took the decision that we were merging for minimum viable product. Therefore, day one, our systems won't be integrated, but we will be legally and regulatorily compliant, and hand on heart we are. And the rest of it will come as a slower journey down the line. So that's my lived experience of the last couple of years on this. What's happening? I think I'm handing over to Paul, aren't I? There we go.
Thank you very much. It was interesting hearing Helen talk through her very recent experiences, because I'm going to share with you some experiences from probably 20 years ago, and the parallels are exactly the same now as they were then, and the issues are the same now as they were then. I guess my starting point, Helen inferred, in that is, can there truly ever be a merger? Because unless you've got the gift of sort of 5 or 10 years planning, ultimately one governance structure or one system has to take primacy and the other has to take secondary. And you might badge it as a merger, but effectively whoever chairs that primary governing body is acquiring the other organisation technically. Although I have got an example of where I think that probably isn't the case. So this slide is a slide that I stole from Dean Royals, and Dean Royals used this back in 2012 when we were talking about the merging of NHS systems. And the point Dean was making when he put this slide up was that the actual strategic fit is the easy bit. Getting the processes, systems and people to all work together in a timescale that fits that strategy is the difficult bit. And I guess we all know how complex our own processes and systems are. And if you can imagine in a short time period integrating those within other organisations, perhaps with no money to do it and no new system to do it, that often is the first stumbling block through due diligence. And I've been involved in an organisation that was going to merge with another organisation, and the due diligence suggested that effort was just not worth the overall aim. So I guess that Helen's been working through that at one level, but if you were to truly merge two institutions, if you think of Manchester back in the early noughties, for example, the complexity of it can't be underestimated. So we haven't got many examples really in higher education to draw upon, and I've had to go back to the noughties really to other than Helen's example, to think of what I would class as real mergers or mergers that we're talking about today. The obvious first one was the creation of the University of Manchester. And I don't know if there's anybody here from Manchester or anybody that's worked at Manchester, but certainly my interactions with Manchester and the feedback I've had from Manchester over the years is even now, in 2024, there is still a divide between the two ex-institutions, partly because of the bricks and mortar, partly because of the disciplines, and partly because of the way in which that merger happened and was implemented. I think we've already touched on what one deal breaker could be, the legalities of it. Can it actually happen legally? Is there sufficient autonomy within that institution to do it without going through certain Senate-type processes, which, as Helen inferred, often lead to resistance? Is there the investment there to actually really properly fund the merger? Because it could save money in the long run, but it will cost money in the short term, because it's a huge change management effort. And we all know if you under-resource a change management effort, then it usually doesn't end well. The attitude and, I guess, the cultural features of the two institutions. Is there that strategic alignment? Is there that complementarity? Will people need to compete for roles, or actually is it plug and socket, and actually the two things could work well together? And there's plenty of examples we can see in the sector of where there are, well, Sheffield being the case in point, a post-92 and a pre-92 sat next to each other, both with different markets, both employing their own services, both with their own car parks, both with their own, etc., etc., etc. So you can see from a sort of geographical efficiency point of view the logic, but is there the strategic or academic alignment? And that's probably why most post and pre-92s haven't had that conversation, because there isn't that academic alignment in the way that would be required to take people on the change journey. The enormity of the task I've touched on, and then clearly the personal relationships and the stakeholders involved. Most mergers or most acquisitions or most coming together of organisations is usually because there's been a relationship formed between either key members of council, governing body, or vice-chancellors and principals. It doesn't happen through happenstance, it happens through relationships. And I guess that back in the noughties, a significant point is that the regulator then, HEFGI, had student numbers in their control. So they could manage the flow of student numbers, and they could actually encourage or discourage mergers by that student number regime, which I'll touch on now with an actual sort of case study. So my first job in higher education was as programme manager for the creation of the University of Cumbria, which was actually a merger of 3 colleges of higher education, one of which was St Martin's, which mainly delivered health and initial teacher training, although it did do some general HEFGI-related provision. The Cumbria Institute of the Arts, which was a specialist art and design college, and then the Cumbrian assets of the University of Central Lancashire. Now, why and how did the University of Cumbria come about? It came about because of political will. It came about because the politicians in Westminster were looking at the distribution of higher education places, and Cumbria and its hinterlands were undersupplied. So a review was conducted, and HEFGI effectively instructed the creation of the University of Cumbria. So it was a political will that forced that change through. And of course, at that time, they could pump prime that by talking about the student numbers they would provide the university. So the initial business plan was based on growth, and it would have seen the institution go from around sort of 10,000 students to getting on to 15, 20,000, which would have been a going concern. 2 years in, HEFGI dissolved. HEFGI didn't dissolve, the student numbers regime dissolved. And the University of Cumbria was left to fend for itself. And of course, as an immature institution with no real market, other than its historic marketplaces, it struggled. And some of you will recall how the University of Cumbria went from sort of a medium-sized institution to quite a small one, actually. But some of the learning I took from that exercise was, firstly, it started from a position of values and a position of place. And actually, nobody could argue with the rationale for University of Cumbria. If you actually think, at that time, if we had degree apprenticeships, if we had different vocational pathways, it would have been an even more logical decision, but they didn't have access to those. They were competing with Lancaster or Northumbria or Newcastle, and that presented issues. The initial business case was effectively flawed because it didn't predict a risk, which was student numbers. More recently, I had the unique opportunity to go over to Aalto University in Finland. Now, Aalto, first of all, I think you've got to understand Finland, like many of the other Nordics, heavily government controlled, quite a lot of government interference and funding. But there was a will to create a new university that brought together some of the specialisms that they knew existed in their higher education sector. But they wanted it to be something different, and they set out a very compelling case for Aalto University being the university for sustainability, the university for student experience in relation to sustainability. And it's gone to be extremely successful. But they did that in a very, very planned and funded way. It was a 5-year period. They appointed a shadow board, a shadow vice-chancellor, and they had shadow governance processes that existing institutions could then plug into. So it was a true merger as opposed to an acquisition. And no one institution had any more control than the other. And we've recently seen that start to happen as well in Australasia. And I guess there's probably an issue there for the UK sector in terms of, are we growing the critical mass in the way other parts of the global sector are? That's part of our discussion today, I guess. So what would I distill as the learning from Aalto and the other experiences I've had some involvement in? I think a clear set of vital few priorities or aims and objectives for why the merger is happening, with high quality data that supports the fact that it will achieve those aims and objectives. And why is that important? It's obviously important in terms of the business case and agreeing those processes with whoever. But it's really important in terms of getting people in the community on board, the why, and what's in it for them. And Helen touched on the need for academic synergy and for academics to see the benefit from it. That was certainly part of what Aalto spent a lot of time consulting and engaging on. How can their specialist academics see a multidisciplinary world where they can benefit? And setting that context was the bit they spent the most time on. There was a long-term direction, there was a preparedness to learn and adapt along the way. They knew that what they would end up with wasn't what they started with. A clear strategic focus on the subject areas they wanted to concentrate on and the USP within those subject areas. And they spent a lot of time priming the community in terms of an entrepreneurship attitude, an innovative attitude, and putting money into those existing institutions to help them innovate in advance of the change. And I think the final point I would make is that it comes down to communication, it comes down to who's communicating it. So University of Cumbria, there was a very clear narrative from government, there was a very clear narrative from all three of the existing principals, and there was a very clear sense from the population of Cumbria that they wanted it. But that won't be the case in some of the mergers or shared service arrangements we're talking about today. In fact, people might not want that change, and that's a very different context to operate in. And I think the final point I'd leave you with is looking outside the sector. It's clear the Treasury are driving efficiencies through the NHS and local government through shared services. I've been involved in my local ICB. They're pooling resources, they're creating shared services, and then mandated to do that. Local government have been doing it for years. There's a fair expectation from Treasury that higher education should be doing something similar. Well, why should we have any more student fee? Well, my argument's a bit flawed because it's just going to 250 quid, but fundamentally, why should they give the sector more money until the sector starts thinking about some of the things to make itself more efficient? And if you draw comparisons with the NHS and local government, it's clear that we haven't done some of the stuff that they've done, and that's coming at us quite quickly, as is the fact that other parts of the global higher education sector are already starting to form collaborations, starting to merge. The latest example being Adelaide, where they've merged the big science and technology university with the big arts university to create a university that's now probably the third or fourth biggest in the UK, if it was in the UK. So they're creating critical mass and they're creating different markets by doing that. What stops us? What do I spend most of my time worrying about? Terms and conditions, pensions, cheaper transfers, all of those nasty, technical, tricky things that actually often end up being the deal breakers in my experience, or end up with a compromised position, not with a true merger. With that, I will leave you for Rhiannon. Thank you.